All right, the video we just watched in class, or that hopefully you watched at home, on Federalism by Khan Academy, does a really good job of explaining the basics of federalism and giving you some examples of delegated, reserved, and concurrent powers. But here in our notes, I just have a couple additional things that I'd like to add. Underneath Roman numeral 2, you can see here in the picture of federalism, it explains that with federalism, we have both federal and state laws. One thing I like to point out is that state laws are usually much more specific than federal laws, because federal laws, just like our Constitution, are usually broader because they have to cover the entire country, which is lots of different kinds of people, geographies, types of, just all sorts of different things from, sea to shining sea. Whereas state laws cover your area, which usually is, for the most part, the people and the geography are similar. To give you an example, I know in California there is a state law that says on prison walls a certain type of vine is not allowed to grow because it's a stronger vine and it could be used by prisoners to escape. We don't have that kind of vine here in Missouri, so we don't need that kind of law. It would be dumb to have that law here, and it would be dumb to have that as a federal law because most places don't have that kind of vegetation, but California needs it. So you might find very specific laws on what types of vines can grow on prison walls. We've talked before about tsunami warnings in certain states, how that's needed or not needed. That's one of the things with federalism, is you're going to see much more broad federal laws and much more specific state laws. Remember, with the Supremacy Clause, that was not part of the video shown by Khan Academy, but the Supremacy Clause is a very important part of our government. It says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and all it is saying is that anytime federal law and state law come into conflict with each other, federal law will win out. The same as when federal law comes into conflict with the Constitution wins out. If a government official comes into conflict with the federal law or the Constitution, the law will win out. We are a nation of laws, not of men. We follow the law. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the Constitution is built on federalism. Lastly, here in our notes, we have this idea of majority rule and minority rights. And it's its own separate idea and principle in the Constitution. And it's the idea that our government is built on the idea that the group that has the most votes will always get their way in government. But the minority, the group that didn't have the most votes, still has the right to speak out on issues. And the majority can at times decide to pass laws that help the minority instead of the majority, because passing a law that the majority wants could harm the minority, take away their rights, put them in a bad situation. And sometimes our government has to look out for the minority instead of the majority. With federalism, this can come into play in a couple different ways. In the example here, back in 2004, it says 60% of Americans were against same-sex marriage. But you still had states that were allowing same-sex marriage. And the reason is, even though a majority of the voters in those states and possibly a majority of the legislators in those state governments were against same-sex marriage, they realized that to take away citizens' rights to marriage was a more harmful than going against the majority's wishes. So many states were allowing same-sex marriage, and as the years went on, more and more allowed it. And the percentage of Americans that were against same-sex marriage did become drastically lower through the years. But even in states where a majority of voters still maybe were against same-sex marriage, you started to see some states allow it because they listened to the minority. They looked out for the minority's rights and realized that the minority's rights were more important than voting with the majority. That is a great example of how federalism and majority rule and minority rights go together. Along with that, with the federalism part of it, nationally, same-sex marriage was not allowed until 2015. But in that time, if your state, like say Missouri, that did not allow same-sex marriage, if you were a couple that wanted to get married of the same sex, you did have the opportunity to go to another state and get married. And that's where federalism comes into play with majority rule and minority rights. It isn't the easiest or least restrictive way to allow minority groups to have rights, but the fact that we have 50 states that all have different laws and different rules means that if you don't like the majority's decision in your own state, you can always go to another state to live, to work, whatever, and find the rights that you crave. So majority rule means the majority is usually going to vote in their favor, but at times they will vote in order to look out for the minority. If you're in that minority and you don't like the way the majority voted in your state, you can always find another state that does give you your rights. And like I said, that's not the easiest way to have life, but it does in our state or our country allow federalism to let everyone find the rights that they're looking for.